We are going live on so many channels at once right now. Like it's just filled up all these different channels that we are live on all at once. Thanks to Chris. So yeah, I'm excited. Today's going to be a fun one. We're going to be talking about commercial split and RTU maintenance. We're going to focus a lot on RTUs, but really just going to be talking about some of the dynamics that exist within commercial equipment maintenance in general. And we've got a great cast here. So we have Chris Stevens. Chris is somebody I've looked up to for a really long time. He's got his own channel. He's a contributor on so many different channels across the interwebs, and somebody who has been a contributor of HVAC School really almost since we've started a site. I mean, like I remember I had your face up as one of our initial contributors when we first started, and I've always really been super proud of everything you've accomplished and a lot of experience on the commercial side. And then Jeff Crable. Jeff is one of our leaders on our commercial team. We call them the light commercial team, or as our refrigeration guys like to joke, they call them heavy residential. But Jeff has been with us a really long time, and super great guy, and helps lead and train that team. And then obviously we have Adam and Matt as always. Eric Melly was going to try to make it, but Eric actually got rear-ended today while he was working and ended up having to go check in at the hospital and stuff. He was still going to try to make it. Didn't seem like it was terribly serious, but still a bit of an ordeal. So
I shot a screw through my finger today.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that specific finger you were just showing us?
Here it is. Yeah. It wasn't that bad.
It looks okay.
Nothing a little electrical tape won't fix.
That's the way you do it. Yeah. Little rag, a little electrical tape. That's the way to go.
Yeah.
So I just want to kind of start with, I'm going to start with you, Chris. I'm just going to put you right on the spot.
Sure.
Because you always talk about the big picture, looking at the big picture of things. And so when you're going to, obviously, I'm sure you've done a lot of maintenance over the years. And so if you're going to do maintenance on a facility that has a decent amount of equipment, obviously a lot of what you do is refrigeration, but say you're going to be doing a decent amount of HVAC maintenance, what are some of the maybe mindset things that you kind of get yourself set with in order to set yourself up for success?
Well, first off, understanding the scope of work, what is required of that maintenance, because in the commercial side, every maintenance can be different. We don't just necessarily attack every single thing. Oftentimes the customers will have a certain list that they want you to knock out. So understanding the scope of work and what they want done is the most important thing. And then being familiar with your equipment is super important. Making sure that, you have an idea how the equipment is supposed to work, right? And then I kind of try to tackle it like when you get to the job site, kind of come up with a game plan, think about what is going to happen. What's the smartest thing to do? Like I work in the desert sometimes where they have a lot of blowing sand. So we have to change AC filters first thing in the morning, because when we change those filters, that sand blows in the building. So every job is going to be different. So just understanding the intricacies of every single location is super important.
So Jeff, I'm gonna turn that over to you. We're talking a lot about RTUs. I mean, really any commercial piece of equipment, but in a lot of cases, we're going to be going on roofs. So what are some of the first things that you think about in preparing a team, or if you're going to be leading a group of guys to go do some maintenance on a big facility? What are some of the first things you want to prepare for and think about?
If it's one of our larger customers, you want to let them know kind of what the customer is expecting, kind of gear them up for, what they're gonna expect of this maintenance. Got to make sure they have all their filters, of course. They gotta have, water access to, get to that water and clean out those drains, things like that.
You mentioned.
Butt in and ask real quick: is water access like an issue for you guys? Because every job site that I'm at, I have water access or I have required the customer to bring water access. So I'm curious about you guys.
Yeah, a lot of times it's, there's one hose nozzle on the whole job site. So you end up driving back and forth. You got to fill it. If you don't have enough jugs of water or enough jugs to fill up, you're going to end up driving back and forth across the property to, fill the jug up over and over again, and it's kind of annoying sometimes. But some places do have, several accesses, and it makes it a lot easier.
Yeah, so we have everything from cases where water is readily accessible to cases where we've got to just bring 300-400 foot of hose, to cases where we're using on smaller locations that you don't have as much equipment or as much cleaning needs. We'll use things like the speed clean, or cases where we actually have a trailer with a tank on it, a pump tank.
Yeah.
And so it really just depends on the situation. And so you have to be prepared. Jeff makes a really good point. As silly as filters are, kind of like everybody knows you got to do the filters. It's amazing how often those filter lists are not updated, whether it's because equipment's changed or whoever initially did it just maybe pulled out the filters that were in there and that's what they wrote down, and maybe they weren't the right size. I mean, that stuff is super frustrating. So on commercial maintenance, just making sure that you have that correct consumables list. And that would be things like your filters, but it would also be things like belts, anything else in cases where you may have UV lights, that kind of thing, and which do exist in some cases, making sure you know what all those consumables are and being prepared to have them on site is huge. Adam, do you do much commercial maintenance at all?
Not really. No.
Really? Yeah. Okay.
I was going to ask, like, you were mentioning making sure you have all the proper consumables. I'm curious, to hear from both you guys, how big of a deal, and is that like part of the normal process if you don't have the correct materials with you to update the database, like to make sure that, okay, now we are changing the list for the next time that we come?
Yeah. It's it's so important for us. And that's a conversation that I have quite often with my guys, is letting us know, if we need something, put it in the notes, send it to the right people, and make sure that we put it in bold. This needs to be updated, because there's nothing worse than driving. I have some jobs that are an hour and a half away, and obviously, depending on the way that you price your maintenances and stuff, sometimes you need to buy the materials from a certain specific supplier to get the pricing that you need, so having to buy it way out in the desert for me can be a problem sometimes. So yeah, it's really important to make sure. And I was going to say, when you were talking about that, Brian, it's really important too. For me, I encourage my guys in our invoicing program, you can go in and you can look at the past notes from the past technician. And it's like, hey, review that. You get on site in the morning, take 10 minutes. I don't care. Review the past invoice. That way you know what you're walking into.
Yeah, for sure. And absolutely huge to know exactly what that client expects. Both of you mentioned that. But for example, you can't just get any old filter in a lot of cases. In a lot of cases, they'll have a specific filter specification that you have to have. In a lot of cases, you'll have certain contracts that will include, for example, coil cleaning, maybe once a year, in some cases twice a year. And you have to know that and provide that client with what they paid for. It's one of the things that I just absolutely hammer all the time when I was teaching. I don't do as much of this now. Now I rely on guys like Jeff and others to do this. But when we had to teach this all the time, it's like we have to give the client what they paid for. It's not up to us to decide whether or not it's the right time. We have to look at that agreement and provide what they agreed to, or what we agreed to with them. Absolutely huge.
And I think it's really important too. Sorry to interrupt, but I think it's really important too, again, to understand the control strategy for your HVAC equipment too. Are you on an EMS system, an energy management system? Is it internet controlled thermostats? Is it, physical thermostats that you can go down and adjust? And then really, I have on a list right here, really important too, is for me, the way that I talk to employees and the way that I do it is I always initiate the first call for cooling on their thermostat. Then once I know their thermostat works, then you can use jumpers and jumper boxes and all kinds of things, because there's nothing worse than testing everything on the roof and then finding out they have a bad thermostat and then the customer complaining,
Yeah, that is a big deal. Well, Jeff, talk about that a little bit, because we do a lot for self-storage, and that's one of the most common things that we run into is just simply not, setting the controls to where the client requires it.
Right. I mean, there's a lot of time when we go through and we set down all these thermostats and freeze that building out, But yeah,
I've left them off before. Customer calls me back, it's freezing, and I found a building at like 65, 64 degrees, and I was blown away. It's like, well, I didn't even know it could get that cold in here. It's because I left jumpers in the unit,
Oh yeah. Or you just leave the thermostat set down to 65 degrees and it just runs nonstop.
For sure.
Yeah, and that brings us back to the old Jim Bergman phrase of becoming masters of the obvious. looking at the big picture, but also just realizing if you don't do the really obvious things right, you don't put in the correct filters, you don't date them and initial them, which is something we're really big on. Make sure that you date and initial the filters so you can prove. And and you don't want to fall into the trap of where you redate and then somebody turns it and they see 2 different dates on the same filter. That's always a bad luck. So it's those little things, making sure that you, like you said, are confirming that the controls actually work. You're not just jumping things out wherever possible. And a lot of that has to do with getting ahead of your client communication. So if you do have to access an EMS system or some sort of building automation system, that you're doing that ahead of time, and that you are being thoughtful at the end to make sure that everything's going back to exactly as it should be before you leave. I wanted to do quickly because in our market, especially, we're in this hot, humid, ridiculous market where drain cleaning is just the biggest thing. So I'm going to give this over to you again, Jeff, and I'll kind of fill in any gaps. But what are some of the biggest things in commercial drain cleaning that you focus on or really hammer?
I mean, there's so many different kinds of drains. You have to really explore what you're working with each time. Come across the common drains. You have to look all the way down there because there could be a vent somewhere like right over a storage unit, because we do work on a lot of storage facilities.
Yep.
And the guys will just push nitro through there, and then next thing you know, they're making it rain inside of somebody's storage unit. So we got to know exactly what we're working with.
And the same thing is true with chemicals too. I mean, you mentioned blowing nitro being a challenge, but if you're using caustic chemicals like Drain Solve or even Triple D, and you're pouring that down a drain, and you're potentially overflowing it, now that's going into somebody's unit, or right, getting on somebody's car, or into their prize rose bush or whatever the case may be. You really need to know about that entire drain assembly, which always drives me crazy when people have just this one size fits all approach. This is how I always do it. Yeah. When they say that, it's like, well, that doesn't always work. Like you got to know the situation.
No, and I'd say, being aware, recently we just had a call where a customer was complaining about a water leak, and they had a common drain setup where they had several ACs draining into a large drain line, which we deal with quite a lot. And those are very interesting to get blown out too. If you've never blown out a common drain that has 6 air conditioners connected to it, you got to disconnect everyone, cap them off, blow them out one at a time to backflow everything. But we never knew about this. We've been doing this customer for years, and it took this instance where it was a previous customer that was in that location, and someone had cut a drain line where a package unit used to go, and it was no longer there, and they left it open in the attic. And so it took a main line restriction for us to try to blow out the drain. And we were on the roof 10 minutes from the location, like from getting down there, and we flooded out their dining room because my technician taped the water hose to the drain line. And because that's a common thing with the common drains, you just let it go. Well, it was flooding out in the dining room, and luckily there wasn't a customer. So, being aware of everything.
Right.
Yeah, for sure.
Another place to look is the condensate pumps. Because you need to completely take those apart and clean them every single time, because they just build up so much gunk inside of them. Over time, they need to be taken apart and cleaned every single time.
I would say with condensate pumps too, depending on if they typically have a float inside of them. And what I've seen in those is, a technician will pour a little bit of water in there, and the float might go up a little bit, but it doesn't go up if you put a massive amount in there or something. So he might see it pump, but there could be slime and build up on the top side of that float, and it can cause problems and create headaches.
Yeah, for sure. I wanted to, somebody just put this in the chat, and I really like this tip. It's just a good general tip. It's the old put the truck keys on the place that you really don't want to forget something. It's like, for example, if you're working on anything that's gas and you take the test ports out, then you put those test ports, with your keys, anything like that, where it's really key that you don't get it. Really important that you don't forget it. Using the keys as a way to make sure that you don't is a really good tip. All right, I'm going to move on to this next one here. One of the other things that exists a lot of times on RTUs that I want to talk about, and in some markets you see a lot of economizers. In a lot of cases, you're just seeing very simple outdoor air hoods. But this is one that gets missed a lot, and I just want to mention this, which is making sure that outdoor air filter is clean. And that's also true in a lot of cases with split systems. In a lot of cases, you will have bird screens and things like that, where you are bringing in outdoor air. In some markets, it actually isn't that desirable, but especially in cases where it's super necessary, or you're using it in something like an economizer where it's actually part of the cooling strategy, it's really important to keep that stuff clean and in good shape. And also, it's very often part of that maintenance agreement. And so even if you don't see a huge value in it, keeping it clean is often a big part of what the client is expecting you to do. And it's something that's very visible to them if they do have a maintenance staff or somebody who walks the roof, and they can see that you haven't been cleaning it, or even worse, if the filters are completely out of place, which happens a lot, especially in our market with, hurricanes and all of that. Any comments on that?
Yeah, those economizers, outside air dampers, whatever you're using them for, are super important. Couple points. Cleaning the filters is detrimental in my market because a good majority of the commercial restaurants that I deal with, they're no longer installing makeup air units on the building, and they're using the outside air dampers as a fresh air intake for the building. So that is our makeup air in a sense. So keeping those filters clean helps to keep the building balanced. The next thing, and I'm guilty of doing this too coming up, is, cleaning those filters is super easy. And it looks like, hey, I could just rinse those off without taking the filter out. So you just rinse the filter off, and, sometimes you might have got away with it, but sometimes that water might go through and go into the return. But nowadays, almost every commercial RTU manufacturer installs their economizer controls in the outside air dampers, and they have outside air sensors in there that you will short out. They already short out just from the outside ambient air, but when you get water in there, it's a big problem.
Yeah, really good point. Yeah. Don't just squirt water on it. Yeah, remove them, clean them properly. In a lot of cases, they're metal mesh, whatever. You can use cleaners in some cases on them, but just get them clean. I mean, the old thing that I always say that Eric Vincent always likes to repeat again and again on social media is just clean it till it's clean, right? And outdoor air filters are the same sort of thing. Just clean it till you can see that it's physically clean. A lot of guys will be like, "Oh, you mean a little bit of that fuzz stuck in there? That doesn't hurt anything." It's like, yeah, but if somebody sees it and you just did a maintenance, there's also that value that you're building, and it's pride in your work, just making sure that things are clean when you've left them. I also want to kind of go back to on the drain side of things, talking about RTUs. I was so stupid when I first started doing this trade. This just tells you how dumb I was. I was a teenage kid, and I would work on RTUs, and I would think to myself, oh, cleaning drains and RTUs doesn't really matter, because if they leak, well, it's just going to leak on the roof, right? That's no big deal. Until I, had a couple pour through the ceilings in restaurants. And one time I was, my worst case was, this was actually a split system. So this is a different situation altogether. But one of my biggest commercial clients was a bank, and they had water running down into where the tellers were. And they're like, "Hey, you just did a maintenance." I was like, "Oh, okay." So I go up there, and there's like this much water on top of the bank vault. And I don't know, it had a belly in it. And so I was up there for like 2 hours just trying to suck water off of the shop vac and hauling it down to the safe deposit room. So I learned the hard way. Always take drains seriously. Clean drain pans, actually open up, take the panels off, clean the drain pans. In some markets, again, not as big of a deal, but in our market, it's huge. You have to take that stuff super seriously. And I wanted to ask the question, Chris, do you, in your market, because you're a little bit drier, right? It's quite a bit drier market.
We have a lot of microclimates here, so it depends on where I'm at, but I certainly don't have humidity like you guys have there. But we do have certain climate areas within our area, but for the most part, it's pretty dry.
Okay. All right. So no, do you use any like pan tabs or any of those sorts of things? Okay.
No, the pan tabs actually annoy me because a lot of the restaurant, depending on how big of a chain they are, they'll have national filter changing companies come in, and they literally throw pan tabs in there, and you'll find 9, 10, 12 pan tabs that are not dissolved, just plugging up the drain. So yeah, it's a bit annoying.
Yeah, I've never been a huge fan. We do use Viper pan and drain spray. We've gotten to enjoy that product because it's not going to clog anything up. So all right, so this one, we had a GIF here. I guess it's not going to play on this. That's a bummer. I was so excited about my GIF.
I watched
it all. Had it all. Wasn't it fun?
It was cool.
I put 5 whole minutes of work into that, and now nobody gets to benefit from it. So let's talk about just coil cleaning in general, and then also splitting coils. What are some of your best practices, Chris? We'll start with you on coil cleaning on larger rooftop pieces of equipment.
So I prefer, again, understanding what the scope of work is and how much time you have on the job. You need to be totally understanding of what's expected. But when you have the time, I prefer to completely take condensers apart. I'm working on bigger package units, right? So I can take side panels off to be able to completely access instead of just dealing with little coil cleaning doors. So some manufacturers, it's easier to take the whole top off the unit, lay it over, you know? So, but I think the first most important thing to address when we're talking about coil cleaning is understanding what kind of cleaners have to be used on that particular coil. It's very important. And you can cause serious property damage and, you know, some bad reputation, whatever you want to call it, for your company if you do some wrong things and use the wrong cleaners.
Yeah, and that's especially true in microchannel. Microchannel is notoriously easy to damage. I don't have any microchannel images up here, but for people who don't understand why that is, in the case of tube and fin, you have tubes and then you have fins that are actually kind of pressed onto the outside. They actually expand the tube into the fins. And so you have this little bit of layer of protection between where the surface where the dirt collects and where the refrigerant actually flows. In microchannel, refrigerant actually flows through a channel. It's this flat channel, and it's all the way to the edge. So now it's only a tiny little channel that's at the edge, but there's refrigerant actually flowing just a little tiny millimeter away from where you're cleaning. And so if you eat away that little bit of aluminum there, you're into refrigerant. Whereas if you eat away the fins on a piece of equipment, now it's not a good thing because you damage fins, you damage heat transfer and all that. And I think we've all seen cases where the fins are completely falling off because somebody, you know, didn't rinse the cleaner off, and you know, it makes a big mess. But you're not going to actually have a leak right away. And that's especially true because in most cases, our older tubing is also copper. And so most of the cleaners that have been designed for generations were really designed to be designed for copper, and so they wouldn't damage the copper that easily anyway. Whereas now you use any sort of caustic, whether it's a alkaline or an acidic cleaner, you're going to run into a very high probability that you're going to damage that little boundary layer on the outside of that microchannel, and you're going to start seeing these little oil spots. And if you've ever worked on a microchannel unit and you've seen just this little dark spot on the outside, that's actually a leak. It's a very small leak because it's a very small channel, but that's obviously a serious problem. And now you potentially damage a super expensive coil that's going to cost a lot to replace. Go ahead.
I was curious to see, or I'm sorry. No. I wanted to see, like, you know, there's different types of cleaner. And like, if you are working on a copper coil, do you guys have like a protocol? Because I know certain cleaners can etch the coil and others are safe and won't etch it. Like, when would you use one over another?
So I would say that first and foremost, you want to use, first off, less is more with cleaners, right? We've all, in my opinion, been using way too much cleaner. And we're wasting a lot of cleaner, and it's not doing what you think it is by using more. Whenever you use a brightener, which, you know, they're the blue cleaners, right? Whenever you use a brightener, that is eating away the coil. It's etching the coil every time you use it, right? It's not as critical on tube and fin, but it kind of is. But as far as choosing the cleaners, I prefer to use, you know, just a non-etching cleaner first, if possible. But I also deal with restaurants where we have grease, right? And again, as a technician, you need to speak, in my opinion, to your upper management before you have to make any decisions to use improper cleaners. But there's sometimes that you have to use the improper cleaners. But, you know, I'm in a position where I can make those decisions. I would encourage everybody out there, don't use the wrong cleaners unless someone okays it above your pay grade, right? So that way you're not making any big mistakes or anything. But if it's grease, you know, it might take a couple passes with a non-etching cleaner to get it clean, where if you use an etching cleaner or a brightener, you know, it's going to clean it really quick. But I think a lot of people misunderstand what clean is. Just because it's shiny silver, that's not necessarily what you want. It's okay for those fins to still be dark colored as long as, you know, stuff's going through them. The shiny silver that we've all gotten used to when you clean a tube and fin condenser is actually too much cleaner, in my opinion.
Yeah, I usually tell my guys, you know, don't use cleaners unless it is absolutely necessary. Just the water alone will clean out all that dirt and get most of everything out of that coil.
That's a good point, especially with microchannel too, because microchannels are so much easier to clean now. But at the same time, because the little passages are so small, you don't even think a microchannel's dirty when it is, right? But I find that they're a lot easier to clean even with low water pressure, because I have some buildings that have horrible water pressure, and it's like the hose goes right through a microchannel, you know, so it's super nice.
Yeah, and there obviously is a case where cleaners are needed, and that's why I'm such a fan of, and again, I don't want to turn this into an ad, but that's why I'm a fan of refrigeration technologies. It's why I'm a fan of their their Viper HD or their condenser coil cleaner. They're all very balanced. They're not heavily alkaline. They're definitely not acidic. They might be just slightly on the alkaline, but they're not going to hurt you. They're not going to hurt the equipment.
No.
And so if you need to get something clean, now again, no matter what cleaner you use, you still have to do a really good job rinsing. And this is something even with non-rinse cleaners, usually your non-rinse cleaners are going to be more for your evaporator. I'm still a fan of rinsing. I'm still a fan of getting things rinsed off. I think it's just it's a good general rule, because we're always relying on everybody to do a perfect mix. You know, like, hey, get the mix just perfect. And that's not realistic. I mean, often we overuse detergent, we overuse cleaners. But even the best of us are very rarely getting that mix exactly right. And so rinsing is just a good idea in general. And so especially when you have not a lot of access to water, you just have to be really, really careful when using cleaners to make sure that you get it all rinsed.
And I agree. I use the Refrigeration Technologies chemicals too. So the yellow Venom Pack or the Viper HD is what we try to use as much as possible, because that's just a proprietary mix of soap and water. Then we'll go to the brightener if we have grease buildup or extreme cases, right? But, and I would say this too, not to be, a complete fanboy of Refrigeration Technologies, but if you mix their stuff right, it's amazing. And if you use their foam gun, there is a difference between theirs and others. So with their cleaners, their foam gun works a lot better. So
now, Jeff, I wanted to ask you, I know, I don't know how much train you worked on. I've worked on, very little commercial, but I've noticed with microchannel coils, after you hose them off, they seem to hold a lot of water, right? Is there something you need to worry about after you're done rinsing a microchannel, or is that not that big of a deal?
I mean, it's not that big of a deal. It's gonna evaporate off of that coil, just after it runs, and that coil gets hot. It's going to, dissipate over time.
I will chime in.
Run low for a while.
Yeah, I will chime in and say that's actually something that I stress with my employees, because in the extreme desert climates where we're hitting, I'm not kidding with you, 120 degrees ambient, so it's might be 125 on the roof. I've seen quite a bit where that surface tension that water's retained in there causes some problems. So I will either pat them, or I'll take a little mini blower and blow out the water to try to help a little bit. I don't know the science behind it, but I just know that I've seen a lot of issues where we'll trip on high head pretty quick if we don't clear that water out, because you'd be surprised how much water's left in that coil when you're done cleaning it on the microchannels. It'll just blow your mind how much will come out. That, and if you don't properly clean and rinse out the microchannels, it sounds fun, and I've shown it in a few videos. It looks funny and it's cool, but it can be bad, as you'll have a bubble party. If you don't get all the soap out of there, when the air starts passing through, it'll start shooting. But the bad thing is you have those bubbles and that moisture getting into the bottom of the totally open condenser fan motors, right? Because they're open on the bottom. So as it's pulling out, it goes right up into the motor, and you can short out a motor really quick too.
That's for sure. I've done that on a couple of blower motors, cleaning out the evaporators and having a bubble party inside of the air handler.
Yeah.
So one of the questions, and this is obviously, because this this photo in the prior GIF was about splitting coils. I'll just tell a quick anecdote. I had a facility that I was having just massive issues with high head pressure, and it was like almost every unit on this roof. And we would wash the coils; they looked clean. The motors were working properly. I couldn't see any damage on the fins, and we were just having excessively high discharge temperatures, excessively high head pressure, and systems that were going out on high head and overload. And this is before I knew about this thing. I didn't know that this was a thing that we had to do sometimes. And it turned out it was a multi-row condenser coil. And once I learned about splitting, we were able to split them, and it looked very much like this. This isn't the same unit, but it was very much like this sort of situation. One of the commenters said, how do you clean them on some of these units that are just so hard to clean? And there is no simple answer. I mean, sometimes it is really, really difficult to do. The manufacturers don't always make it easy, but as much as possible, just trying to get a little bit of a gap, disconnecting on one end, separating them out, supporting them. This is generally going to be something, and this is something that, again, I just want to reiterate. When we get into talking about commercial maintenance, especially, there is no one size fits all solution. In some cases, you're going to have to charge more. In some cases, it's not included. In some cases, it is. It all depends on how these agreements are negotiated. So you can't guess at this stuff. And in almost every case, things like splitting a condenser coil are going to be an extra charge. I mean, this is a very time consuming thing, but in a lot of cases, it can make a massive, massive difference. And I always, want you to be aware that just because something visibly looks clean, if you have indications with your readings that are telling you that it's not, or there's still a problem with your head pressure, it's very likely that this is the sort of thing that you may have going on, impacted dirt either in between coils or actually inside the coil itself.
I would agree. In the first part of my career, just like what you said, I didn't know that there was multi-row coils. I had no idea. And I can still think back to problems going, oh, that's probably why. And oh, that's probably why. The really cool thing is we have people sharing our experience, right? Brian sharing his, I'm sharing mine, and Jeff, Adam, Matthew, we all share these experiences we have. So maybe you guys can learn and not make the same mistakes as us. And, 20 years ago, we could get away with a lot more. And what I mean by get away is customers were very forgiving. In today's day and age, I don't see that anymore. Customers are pretty quick to move on to the next guy because the next guy's cheaper, right? And whatever. So you got to do your best, and understanding and, again, the scope of work. Most of my customers, splitting coils is not part of the routine maintenance. That's typically a thing that's done on a need to need, on when it needs to be done, basically.
I'm kind of curious, like when you split a coil, because I'm looking at this right now, and I'm imagining if you have a rooftop unit on top of a curb adapter and you're splitting a coil, do you need like a second person there, or do you need something to like pin the coil up as you kind of pull it apart? Like, how does that work out?
Again, kind of like what Brian said, it's a case-by-case basis, but majority of the time, this particular brand you're looking at right now, that's an older style unit. You needed two people because that condenser fan shroud, I've done it by myself, but it's ridiculously heavy. That particular brand has since added coil cleaning accesses on top of the condenser fan shroud, so you technically don't have to pull it, but if you need to do a thorough clean, you still have to pull it, and those things are heavy, so sometimes you might need two people. There's some brands where you can just pull the whole side off the unit. You can do it with one person. It's super easy.
Yeah, for sure. Exactly what he said. I mean, especially if you're on like you said, an adapter curb or something in your way up there, that's going to make it even more difficult. Which goes back to one of my classic photos that I got more flack on than anything I've ever posted, where I had one of my guys standing on top of a step stool. It was a 2-step step stool. And everybody's like, he's standing on top of a ladder. That's against OSHA. So I pulled up, 30 different references where it's a step stool. It's supposed to be stood on top of, So anyway, not gonna get into that again.
I get flack for using the OSHA approved cinder blocks that are on the roof too.
Yeah.
So,
Absolutely. Get those approved. All right, keep rolling through. So let's talk about, now we're seeing fewer and fewer belts and pulleys, especially on smaller rooftop units and that sort of thing. But just talk through a little bit basics here. I'm going to go. Let's start with you, Jeff, on the belt side. What are some of your kind of? I mean, you don't have to go into all the techie nerdy stuff. Well, we'll cover that really well. But what are some of your top things that you tell guys when it relates to belts?
Well, most of all, you gotta make sure the belt is not too tight or too loose. I know. Back when I first started, I would go find these worn down belts and, tighten them onto the pulleys. And it was doing more harm than good. But yeah, I'm always telling the guys, it's like kind of like a bass string, it's got to be semi loose, but semi tight at the same time. It's a fine line there.
It's really important, and I'm going to out myself. Tension, what do you call these? Tensioners?
Yeah, tension tools, yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to tell you guys this right now. I've actually never used one of these. I have one sitting in my desk.
Oh, you sinner.
I've never used
Did you buy that for the show?
No, I saw it on the thing and I was like, oh, I have one of those in my drawer. I've had it sitting here forever. Now, I'm not saying they're not valuable. They are. Okay. It's really important. I encourage people to do things right. Clearly, I've learned from a lot of mistakes. Really should be using these, but more so than making sure the belt's tight, right? Or not more so, but really importantly is understanding that you can recognize problems in a belt, and you can see a belt, and you can know, from experience, you'll be able to look at a belt and you'll say there's a problem with the pulley, right? You can see the wear patterns in the belts. Pulleys or sheaves, I get flack for that one too, right? So pulleys or sheaves are really important, and they're I consider them a consumable. I mean, they wear out on a regular basis, especially adjustable ones. And if customers aren't doing routine maintenance, the pulleys will wear out even faster, right? If the belts are loose on a regular basis, and a technician will go out there and he'll tighten up the belt, and then he'll get a call the next night and you'll go out there and the belt's laying next to the unit, right? Because the pulley's worn out, the belt got stuck in it, and something has to give, right? So the belt will jump off the pulley. So knowing the proper tension, right? And we wouldn't have to struggle about the proper tension if I actually used one of these, right? And actually tension the belt right. But also knowing the type of equipment you're working on, right? If you're working on a tiny fractional horsepower motor on a rooftop exhaust fan, that's like a 3rd horsepower motor, you can't tighten that belt super, super tight, right? You have to know, and you have to be able to, again, case by case, judge the situation.
Yeah, and there's a couple really good, I was going to say rules of thumb. These don't even make it to the level of rule of thumb. That's how loose these are. But a couple phrases that I've heard. One is that you want a belt to be as loose as it can be without having any slippage, right? And the reason that is because what's the point of a belt? Well, why don't you just direct drive it? Because direct drive is so much initial force, right? So this allows us to transmit force without that huge shock. It actually gives a little bit of buffer there. So you want to have that buffer. You don't want it to be as tight as you can possibly get it. But the other side is that, just to what you just said, a smaller motor, a smaller pulley, a smaller wheel is going to tend to be on the looser side. Somebody just mentioned great big, giant McQuay system, or a big Seasons 4, or some gigantic system that's got, multi-row, big old wide pulleys on them. Those things are going to be tight. I mean, they're designed for it. It's heavier duty, it's bigger, and that's. And again, I'm really talking out my butt right now, because the truth is that you should actually look at what the manufacturer says and use a tensioner, but be practical here, right? If you go to a really big unit like that and you see a bunch of slop in a belt, well, that belt's loose, and more likely the belt's worn out, or they have the tensioner in the wrong position, or the tensioner slipped, or something like that. On a smaller unit, if you find that somebody tightened it really tight, well, then you're probably going to throw a belt. You're going to potentially damage bearings. You're going to potentially damage the motor. So just be pretty sensible about these things. A lot of people will talk about silly rules like, a ½ inch of deflection, or an inch of deflection, or whatever they make up. That means nothing, because deflection really depends on how long the span is of the belt there. Thank you. Span was the word I was looking for. And so obviously, if you have a shorter span, you're going to have less deflection than a longer span. And that's where, if you want to know, and this is why I like these tools for somebody who's never done it before, or for somebody who's very inexperienced, where they really sort of want to be able to calibrate that finger, to know what's normal. Use the tool so you can figure it out. But over time, you're going to get a really good sense of what's too tight and what's not tight enough. And back to the initial point that Chris made, making sure that you don't have damaged pulleys and sheaves, making sure that everything is in alignment, that's actually far more important than getting that tensioning exactly perfect. Because the reality is, if you get it perfect, you're going to walk away for 10 minutes, and it's not going to be the same after 10 minutes of runtime than it was when you just tensioned it anyway. So you don't, you're never going to be exactly perfect in terms of tension.
And I would say that you can tell a lot from a belt. You can tell a lot by the wear patterns on belts. And again, as a new guy walking in, you're not going to know right away, but over time, and this is something that we haven't brought up yet, but as you do more routine maintenances, right? You're observing, you're retaining, you're listening. And I know I'm going to offend a bunch of people right now, but I don't think you should be wearing headphones on a roof. I think that unless you need them for hearing protection, my personal preference, headphones, music shouldn't really be up there, because when we're up there, we're being paid by the customer. we're listening, we're looking, we can hear things from across the roof. You start to get used to this, right? And you know the locations. So I think that's really important.
Right.
Yeah, for sure. Any thoughts, Jeff?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things that'll tell you if that belt is out of line. You'll see that black dust everywhere,
Mm-hmm.
On one of the pulleys, and those belts just wear down over time. It's been 100 times we've been back to a call, and it just keeps blowing belts, and it's like, look, guys, you gotta tell if it's in line or not.
Yeah, alignment is a really big thing, and it's brand specific too, because there's some manufacturers that their motor brackets are just junk. They really are. And if you tighten down the belt, you'll notice that the motor brackets will completely flex on the units brand new, and you'll never get those pulleys in line. Like, it's just, and sometimes you have to find a happy medium, right? It's a struggle. The other thing, and I don't know if you're going to bring up a slide or not too, but when you get into dual belt scenarios or triple belt scenarios, it's really important to make sure that if you are replacing belts, you're changing all the belts at the same time. They need to have equal wear. Best case scenario, they're a matched set. That's getting harder and harder to find, but a matched set is the serial numbers align. The belts are all within range, but that's even harder and harder to find. But one of the biggest things when you have multiple belts is they need to be the same brand and the same style. I've countless times I've gone up and you see one that's cogged, one that's not, like all these different things. And that just, that's a headache.
Yeah, for sure. One thing I wanted to mention just on this slide is these are a couple dumb things, but whenever I talk about belts, I always just have to say it. In most cases, you're going to be aligning centers. So here it's showing align the outside edges, but that's only in cases where the pulleys are the exact same width. And nowadays, they almost never are, because in a lot of cases, you're going to have an adjustable sheave or shiv on one side, and that's going to be a wider pulley. Also, when you are going to be installing or removing belts, the right way to do it, and I'm referring to Doc Comfort and his sarcastic comments on there, is when you roll the belt on and off, you are going to stretch the belt out. I mean, you're going to damage the belt to some degree. Is it going to be catastrophic? Well, and that just depends, but that's not a best practice. Best practice is to actually adjust in so that you can remove and replace the belt easily that way. But you do not adjust the adjustable shiv in order to do anything. You don't do it in order to get the belt on and off. You don't do it to change the current on your blower. That's not what you do. You also don't tension, or you don't set the tension on your belt by your blower amps either. No. That was something that one of the first guys I ever worked with told me, and definitely incorrect. Those are completely different things. And if you're tensioning a belt so tight that you're actually affecting your blower current, you're doing something wrong. That's not a good thing. Can you imagine a guy like trying to adjust all the way to FLA by just continuing to tighten the
well, and then the funny thing is he has the blower panel off the entire time, right? So he's setting it with the blower panel off, and then he's all done. He puts the panel on. All of a sudden, everything changes, and
good stuff. All right, what else we got in here? Oh, this is a big one, and this was actually one of the earlier questions that I wanted to. I don't know if I have it here, but one of the questions, especially with RTUs, is the whole discharge line versus liquid line issue. So, Chris, what's your take on this? I mean, people say set by subcool, but you don't even have access to a liquid line service port. How do you approach, checking or setting charge on equipment where you don't have access to a liquid line?
Well, first off, obviously, the elephant in the room is airflow before charge, right? Let's make sure the belts are tight, filters are clean. Something that I have on my list right here to cover is if we're testing the unit, outside air dampers closed. If we're testing for testing purposes, because the unit specs and the data from the manufacturer is going to be based with the outside air dampers closed. You open those, it's going to throw your TDs off and everything. So when it comes to charge, what I find is on certain particular manufacturers that have fixed orifice metering devices, you are going to have a significant pressure drop from the discharge to the liquid, sometimes up to 35 PSI. So that is a measurable number when it comes to a subcooling number. But most manufacturers have a specific way that they want you to charge their equipment, right? So if it's a fixed orifice metering device, majority of the time, they're going to do some sort of target superheat setting. If it's an expansion valve system, depending on the manufacturer, it might be subcooling, or it might be approach temperature. So every manufacturer is going to be different, right? But again, airflow before everything. So close those outside air dampers, then evaluate a system. If airflow is good, then you can start playing with the charge, doing different things. And, you know, some of those manufacturers don't publish all the information we need. So sometimes we have to make, you know, educated guesses, right? Guess probably isn't the right word, but I mean, we have to use our experience, and we have to use, I lean on technology, right? So I'll lean on technology to give me vitals in front of my face. And, you know, then I can kind of evaluate everything. When you use technology and you use apps, you can have everything. You can have airflow and everything in front of you. So you can look at it and say, you know, superheating and subcooling are off, but my airflow is really low. Okay, well, wait, we got to evaluate this a little bit more. So that's kind of my start with that. And everyone's going to change.
I'm curious though, like, because I've run in that too, where I'm like just not sure, like when you only have a port on the discharge, like how can you even measure, like what is there even a process for accurately measuring subcooling?
You can't get the temperature off of the liquid line.
Yeah.
Do the mathematics that way.
I would say that's a great point for when you're commissioning, having viable data and recording that data for the next technician to walk behind you. You know, I'm not going to say I've done this for my entire career, but it's up until recently. When I start up a unit, I'm going to commission it, and I'm going to take down all that information, and we're going to save it, whether it be in software or we're going to write down valuable information. So we know, you know, this is what the conditions were in this situation. But again, every manufacturer is going to be different. So now that I know a manufacturer that uses fixed orifice metering devices, you know, I noticed that they have about a 35-degree pressure drop. So I can use the discharge line now because I know, or 35 PSI pressure drop, right? So I can use the discharge pressure now, subtract 35 from that, figure out my saturated temperature, and get a roundabout subcooling for that unit and kind of get a better idea. But again, that manufacturer, most of them don't publish subcooling numbers. They just tell you pressures. So
yeah, so what it comes down to is if you use discharge line pressure and liquid line temperature, you're going to think that you have more subcooling than you potentially do. One thing that I've played with, and I actually have had, it depends on the coil design and whether you have what type of guards you have on it, whatever. But if you can get to where you can at least somewhat visibly see the coil, and you use a thermal imaging camera, you can kind of see where subcooling starts. It's a really interesting thing. And so you can look at those, you know, bottom row or bottom two rows and say, all right, that's where I've got subcooling, and that's a pretty good indication as well. But one of the other big advantages, and this is something that I would always say to people who haven't worked in a lot of commercial and now you start to do this, when you're working on bigger facilities, one of the advantages is at least you have other stuff to compare to, right? So you're now, of course, you could have every single piece of equipment on that roof has bad airflow, like the example that I gave, or maybe every single unit is undercharged or overcharged, but that's less likely, especially with packaged equipment where it comes with a set charge in it. And so now you can just compare them to each other. You can look at even things like one of the examples they gave earlier for poor condenser airflow was really high elevated liquid line temperatures, right? And so when you have 3 units that have, you know, maybe it will say, you know, 100-degree liquid line temperatures, and then you have another one that's at 115, you know, one of these things is not like the other. That one, it probably has a dirtier condenser coil. And again, that's not perfect, but that sort of comparative analysis can be pretty handy in those sorts of applications. Obviously, that's not how you set a charge. So how you set a charge is the way the manufacturer tells you to, and then ultimately, when you're really in a bind, you have to weigh it in. And that's, you know, worst case scenario, especially in something like a split system, that's not going to be easy to do. But we have options in those cases, and that's also where more non-invasive testing can come in handy. You're literally just looking at things like your liquid line temperature, suction line temperature, discharge line temperature, and kind of using that as a proxy for actually measuring refrigerant pressures, especially when you have baseline to go off of. Really doesn't work if you don't have a good solid baseline to go off of.
Right. I would say too, you know, understanding the limitations of your tools. I use a lot of smart probes, right? And different softwares. And when you're working on a package unit, I'm going to, you know, go out there and say, you can't always put your air probes and your temperature probes in the ideal locations. Now we should certainly, right? But I've got a restaurant full of people and I can't take that supply air probe, walk it downstairs, climb up a ladder, hang it in the first supply drop and get a proper mixed discharge air, right? So I'm putting it up at the terminal, right, at the unit. So in the back of my mind, I'm always knowing I'm probably going to have, if it's running and cooling, a colder than normal discharge air temperature because I'm really close to the evaporator coil. So just because I have software in front of me saying that this is what's wrong, me as the technician has to recognize that, like, okay, my numbers are going to be a little bit skewed here. So that's when you got to start really taking in experience and say, yeah, this unit's doing everything it can, or, you know, we need to investigate further.
Yep. So spidey senses that we hear about sometimes. And to your point, like, especially when this is something I always like to bring up, whenever you're using a sensor to measure air and you're exposing it to any sort of cold or hot surface, no matter what it is, you're going to affect the measurement of that sensor. And sometimes it's not a huge deal, but you do want to keep that in the back of your head. Like, is this sensor in line of sight to my evaporator coil? Okay, then it's going to read colder than it actually is in the airstream. Yeah. And those are important things to kind of keep in mind there. I wanted to, before because we got a couple of questions we want to get to. I just wanted to talk about, let's just talk about this a little bit. Phase monitoring, phase loss, voltage imbalance. We talked about this, was it last week or 2 weeks ago? But this is really a big deal with doing maintenance on three-phase equipment. For people who aren't used to three-phase, just paying attention to making sure that you don't have imbalances in voltage. And a lot of times that comes down to wear in your contactors, things like that, which can be a bigger issue on three-phase than on single-phase equipment. So any thoughts on that, Chris or Jeff?
I do. I just don't want to keep jumping in. You know,
Jeff will be happy if you do. Trust me.
Yeah, I'm in Southern California, so we have a lot of lower than normal voltage when it comes to the buildings in the summertime. So I'll see a 208 three-phase system drop down as far as 187 volts sometimes in the summertime, right? When it gets really, really hot, the substations are overloaded, the grid's just at peak. And voltage monitoring, I call it power conditioning. Don't know if that's the right phrase for it, but is very important. Not enough customers utilize that. And because of that, we see a lot of issues with a lot of the technology that's in package units these days. We have VFDs that are installed in the package unit, in the mixed air cabinet, which is not the smartest location, but you know, it is what it is. And we see a lot of issues. So voltage monitoring with something like that ICM 450 right there is a really good thing. Setting the parameters so that way the unit locks out, you know, and then stores the parameters. That's really important. Make sure that you're installing it, you know, and shutting down the unit in the right way though, so that way it doesn't completely power down, you know, just understanding. But that is very important for sure.
And it's one of the things that and a lot of newer equipment comes with voltage monitors in them, phase monitors, all that kind of various different types. Some just have like anti-reversal in them, but they don't really have true phase monitoring. But a lot don't. And so in terms of one thing that is a valid upsell in the three-phase market, this is one of them. And it's one that I actually did a lot when I was a tech doing a lot of commercial maintenance. One thing that I wanted to show, one of my favorite calculators that we have for free in the HVAC School app is this one, which is our voltage imbalance calculator. And so you can just put in the three voltages, and not only does it tell you, so if you measure all three legs to each other, not only does it tell you if you're in the acceptable range, but it also tells you the temperature increase percentage that you get in your motor due to voltage imbalance. And so a lot of times the reason why you'll get slight voltage imbalances is because of things like wear in your contactors or in your starters or poor connections and all that. But literally sometimes it's just the utility. And sometimes it's the way that electricians have, you know, those darn electricians, the way that they've set up the panels and the way that they've done balancing on the panels. So they have a lot more load on one of the bus bars than others. And because of that, you get more voltage drop on that single bus. And so when you start to get anything over 1% voltage imbalance, it can have a pretty significant impact on the longevity and efficiency of the equipment. So just something to keep in mind there if you have never thought about that on the three-phase side of things, for those of us who have done more single phase. Want to get to a couple questions before we finish off here. This is one for you, Chris. How do you feel about keeping universal belts on vans for emergencies?
I actually, again, it's all dependent on what you do in your market and what your customers demand of you. I actually don't really carry belts in my vans, and I only carry emergency rescue belts. So we'll put a rescue belt on there, whether it's a B belt or an A belt, which are the what do you call those? They're the notch ones where you can take them apart, put them back together. They're just emergency belts. And that's what we typically keep on our vehicles for our customers, that we almost demand this when we do a routine maintenance with a customer, is we keep spare belts on site. So that makes it easy. So then we just have an emergency belt for that weird situation where you need one on the weekend. But we find that belts just sit in the van forever and ever and ever and ever and ever. And then we end up with a giant pile of unused belts in the shop. And so we just don't keep them anymore.
Yeah, I would. Go ahead, Jeff.
I just said that covers it.
Yeah, I like that approach. We haven't been good about always even stocking the emergency belts, but it is a good practice if you have cases where belts actually fail on you. But the one thing that you said that is huge is if you get a belt, get an extra and keep it on site, so that way you've got an extra there. That makes perfect sense. And then obviously, if you're wearing out belts quickly, look at why. Is it because you have pulley damage? Replace the pulley if it's damaged. Is it because it's misaligned? Get it aligned properly. Don't make excuses for that stuff, because that's very, very common in the world of belts. And like I said, we're seeing less and less of them, but there's still obviously a ton of them out there.
Yeah.
Here's a question about what to do when it's cold or rainy. What do we do if it's cold outside? Do you still check cooling stages? How do you handle that?
So for me, I prefer not to check cooling stages when it's cold outside. But what I would do in that situation is just give a disclaimer to the customer. I cannot thoroughly go through this because I'm starting to hit freeze protection at this point, right? Because if it's 35 degrees outside and raining, the building temperature is probably going to be in the 60s. So when you're trying to run an air conditioner, we're going to get that evaporator coil temperature down into the 20s, and we're going to start going off on low pressure or hitting freeze protection. So in that situation, if a customer demanded that we do something for us, we would document everything and then just make sure that they understand all we did was make sure it operationally turned on and off, unless you can simulate something, right? Sometimes certain situations you can run the heat for a long time, bring up the building temperature. If it's a small split system, you can put a charging jacket on there if that's what you want to do. Personally, I'm not a huge fan of those, but I mean, you could do it if you have to. So just depends.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And also ultimately with commercial agreements, it comes down to what you agree to with the client, right? Yeah. So it's good to have provisions in there for that. This is another case though, where if you are required to do some sort of basic testing, you definitely benefit from having multiple pieces of equipment, because now it's going to be less about saying, is the charge perfect? And it's going to be more about like, hey, is this system significantly low? Yeah. And that's where you can shut all the disconnects off on the condensers, go through, fire them up one at a time, and literally just look at liquid line and suction line temperature and say, hey, are these all coming up at about the same rate as each other? This one's behaving like an outlier. Okay, maybe there's a problem with this one that we should pay attention to. There's kind of creative things you can do like that. But again, it all comes down to communication with your client at that point.
Yep, for sure.
All right. One of this is about rule of thumb. I think that's going to be a little tough to cover here. All right, here's one. This is not so much a maintenance thing, but how do you go about finding a restriction in the distribution tubes?
I would say it depends on what you mean by distribution tubes. So I deal with a certain manufacturer that uses a liquid header that has 15 fixed orifices in each one.
Yeah. I was going to guess that that's probably where they were going with this. Yeah.
Yeah. And that one is actually rather easy. I mean, if it's a severe restriction, you can look it up for frosted up tubes, right? So if you have 15 liquid tubes going across with an orifice, you can start to see frost build up on certain tubes, but clearly you're going to see it in your vitals too, as the system's operating, right? You're going to see lower than normal capacity. But in general, I mean, finding restrictions in a system that has multiple liquid headers, multiple orifices, or even an expansion valve system that has distribution tubes coming off the expansion valve. I mean, it can be tricky, So again, this is where paying attention when you're doing normal maintenances, using dumb logic. Like, okay, every time I come, I know this sounds silly, but every time I come, none of these tubes are frosted up. Well, how come 2 of them are frosted up now and not all of them? Like, right. Just kind of start backwards calculating things.
Yeah, one of the tips that I learned really early on was freeze the evaporator coil on purpose. So basically disconnect your blower, let that evaporator coil get really cold. And so even if it is, you know, the distributor that's post your metering device, if you are freezing your coil and you start to see really asynchronous patterns, that's an indication. Now you got to be careful with that, because you're not always going to get exactly the same feed patterns, but you don't want to see one tube that's, you know, staying warm, or one tube that's freezing far before the others. It really depends on how extreme the restriction is, obviously. But that has helped me through a lot of pickles when I'm trying to find restrictions, because in some cases you'll even get cases where you actually have a restricted evaporator itself, and it's not actually in the tubing of the evaporator, but it's like maybe it's in the outlet of the distribution tube that's coming from your distributor to the evaporator coil. So we have run into some weird stuff like that.
You know, I don't think, you know, the more experienced a technician becomes, the more he's going to have these little tools that he has in the back of his head. Again, I call it dumb logic, but sometimes you just like, okay, I know that this thing runs this way and it's not running this way this time. You know, I know that, like you said, you know, you're going to shut off the blower motor and you're going to watch the way the coil frosts up. Okay. So, you know, it's those little tips, you know, that I think make the difference for some techs. If you actually listen and pay attention, and then it all goes back to, you know, listening when you're on the roof and observing and just getting used to the sounds and the things that you see, you know, understanding basic operations.
All right. So we've been talking over Jeff most of this time, so we're going to give him the last word. Jeff, so say our light commercial techs end up watching this, and there's like one thing you want to get through the thick skulls as they're wrapping up with this. What's your final word?
Oh man, that's a tough one. And say, you know, update that equipment list.
right back to the beginning.
Yep.
Right back to the beginning. Get the equipment and consumables updated. Make sure you have the right filters and belts. That's good stuff.
There's nothing worse than showing up to a PM with all the wrong filters.
Yeah, I agree. I've been there. Good stuff. Well, hey guys, thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy week. I see a lot of Matt, especially, looks very sleepy tonight. So I heard it was a pretty tough day today. But yeah, thanks for making this happen. Prayers are with Eric Melly, who couldn't make it. I trust all as well. I'll follow up with him afterwards. But yeah, thanks guys, and everybody out there, just continue to keep your eyes open, stay safe. Do good work, try to get a little better each day, and we'll see y'all again soon.
Yeah, thank you guys.
Thank you.